Okay, that was not what I intended to happen. And they're full screen. Get bigger. Okay, I think that's as big as it's going to get. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ben Goodrich. This is 5065, Bayesian Statistics for the Social Sciences. It's a QMSS class. There's a number of people here on the wait list who are not QMSS students. That's fine. As you can see, we have plenty of desks, albeit closely cramped together and subject to tripping over people's phones. So we should be able to let everybody in eventually. That process will, I don't know when it's going to happen, but this week, next week, something like that. So if you're on the waiting list, just stay there. Assume you'll get in officially at some point. If you're not on the wait list but are thinking about taking the class, put yourself on the wait list as soon as possible, just in case we get a situation where we might have too many people for this room. If you're a QMSS student, you should enroll through SSOL. Once we have a pretty firm count of the number of QMSS students, then we can get everybody else put in. You don't need a login to get to the course webpage, which is on Canvas. So even if you're not officially enrolled in the class yet, you can get to the syllabus, everything like that. I'm currently YouTubing this class, and so I'll put a link also to my YouTube channel where you can get these videos if you need to review them. So what else did I want to say about that? If you're part of Columbia or even not part of Columbia that doesn't use SSOL, you need to take a registration action form to the QMSS office, which is on the 8th floor of the International Affairs Building. Just fill that out, give it to Megan McCarter in the QMSS office, and she will process those forms. We have two TAs, one of whom is sick, but the other of whom is here. Terry is going to be, and also Xiaoling is going to be our TAs. They'll be grading, also, having appointments with students to talk about things, talking with you all on Campus Wire. So let me see if I can make this bigger. So covered through all that. Talk about what the class is today. So grading, we'll have 1/6 of the weight be put on class participation, both actively in the class lecture time and also online. So we're going to be using Campus Wire as our online communication thing. You can go to this link on the syllabus. If it asks you, enter in this code, and it'll take you to our page where you can post questions and even better answers about anything related to the course or Bayesian application of quantitative methods. More generally, can discuss pretty much anything there, but particularly things about the course. Some people who were on Campus Wire last year have told me that it only takes you to like last semester's page, which is now more or less dead. You may have to go in the search box and type in like Bayesian or something like that to find this class, and then you click on it and it'll add you and it'll add this class to the classes on the left, so you can keep up with things. So Campus Wire also will be counted toward the class participation thing. Should pretty much eliminate the need to email either me or the TAs. If you need to post something about your grades or something like that, there's an option when you make a post in CampusWire for like instructors and TAs only. Otherwise, your post will be public, and then more people can answer it. You can upvote things and stuff like that. Anyway, CampusWire is kind of a work in progress by a startup, but we used it last semester, and it seemed to work well about 97% of the time. Pretty self-explanatory, more self-explanatory to you all than it was to me, but I figured out how to use it, so I figure you can as well. So there'll be a lot of participation going on there, just because what we're talking about can be pretty controversial within the sort of statistics and quantitative methods communities. Also, there's going to be plenty to talk about that we're not going to have time to explicitly address during class. So being able to do that online works out pretty well. So what would be considered like good class participation? Basically, once a week, having like a good question, not just like when it's a homework due, but about something, substantive, or, providing a well thought out substantive answer to someone else's question. If you do that about once a week, I would say you're on a pretty good pace as far as class participation is concerned. We don't have any books to buy. Pretty much all the stuff we read is online. But there are some things that we refer to more than others, and the links to that are given in the section on books. Columbia also has a number of books that we're not using but are available through the Columbia Library System online. Those can be particularly useful, particularly this Introduction to Probability by Joe Blitzstein and Jessica Wong. This is something, if you need more practice with probability, and almost all of you will, that is a really good undergraduate textbook to probability. And Joe also has videos from a class like this, or not exactly like this, but a class that he also YouTubes the videos for his class at Harvard. So that is pretty much it. We'll start this week with an introduction to the course, where we're going to be covering this semester and kind of taking it from there. Were there any questions before I get started with that? Okay. So 5065. This course being a QMSS course, and R being the almost official language of the QMSS, although there's increasing number of classes that also use Python. Anyway, we'll be using R exclusively as the language to do the classes. So the homeworks will be in R, actually R Markdown. So if you've used R but not R Markdown, that's totally okay. We'll show you how to use R Markdown. It really takes like 10 minutes to learn how to do R Markdown if you already know R. If you don't already know R, this class is going to be really difficult, because we don't really teach the basics of R. So we use R like every class period. You should bring your laptops, not so much today, but starting Thursday. We use R for everything. It's not like we're using terribly complicated R syntax this semester. Probably use like less than 10 packages. So you don't have to have a super deep understanding of R, but if you've never been in a class that used R before, it's going to be a real challenge for you to keep up with this, because we don't really go over the basics of R, like what is a list, or how do I assign to assembler, or stuff like that. That is all stuff that it's fair to assume the QMSS students already figured out the first semester or the previous semesters they were here. And so, second semester classes, we just kind of take that for granted. Now, there have been students who didn't know R coming into it, but they knew another programming language like Python or C++ or Java or something like that. So if you know another programming language, it's possible that you can pick up R quickly enough to, you know, stay on pace with what we're doing. But if you really only know more of a GUI focused thing like Excel or SPSS or Stata and have never used really a real programming language before like R, then it's just going to be very hard. Not only like the difficulty of the Bayesian stuff, but just, you know, figuring out what the little code snippets and stuff that I put up mean. And so if you're a QMSS student, you should already be okay. If you've used R in a previous class, should already be okay. But if you haven't had any exposure to a language like R, it's probably going to be a real struggle. And we can't just, you know, constantly be, you know, talking to Terry and yelling like, can you teach me R, just so you can stay up to date with a class that utilizes R, such as this one. Anyway, so Stan is another programming language that we will learn this semester. So you don't need to have any previous exposure to Stan at all. Stan is language. It's a little bit like R or C, but it can be accessed from a variety of other interfaces. We'll use the R interface exclusively this semester, but when you're done with this semester, you may prefer the Python interface to Stan or the Julia interface to Stan or things like that as you go forward after this semester. So, you know, if you're part-time or something like that and you're worried, well, will I be able to use this in my job that, you know, it's a Python place or something like that? Yeah, you probably will. Once you understand the Stan language and what we're doing with it, then calling it from Python is not going to be, you know, much more difficult than anything else that you might be doing with like pandas or NumPy or something like that in Python. Questions about that? So really the only prerequisite is some familiarity with R. Cool. All right. So what is Stan? So if you watch Billions, you probably saw that Stan featured prominently in episode 9, season 3. You can, you know, click on this if you haven't seen this particular episode yet. So it's coming mainstream. Perhaps more impressive than Billions is Thousands, which is the number of downloads from unique IP addresses that we have achieved at the end of 2018. On the RStudio mirror, there's other mirrors which you can get the RStan package, but the main one that people use is the RStudio one, and that's the one that people keep track of for things like that. So we've recently surpassed 1,000 unique downloads per day, which is kind of arbitrary, but it seems like an important number over the years. Stan, we actually started developing in 2011, but we didn't have an R package on CRAN until 2015. And so from relatively small startup, it's been increasingly being downloaded and being used and becoming more of a well-known thing among places that take sort of statistical modeling seriously. And so, you know, it's something that you'll see you being referred to, but also, you know, as time goes by, I think more and more, you'll see more people having heard of Stan or having used of Stan. So again, if you're part-time or something or worried about, well, you know, am I going to be able to use Stan or something like that for your job when, you know, no one at your office has heard of Stan yet? That will probably change some point in the near future. And so this is really, I think, a trend that you as students or part-time students should be looking to ride. Because it's, you know, one of a number of things that in the past several years has really started to take off, and made Bayesian inference a lot more practical in a lot more wider set of circumstances. And we've had, similar trends with Python and other interfaces that you can use Stan from. So that said, Columbia requires me to say that I am an employee of Columbia University, and Columbia University has gotten like millions of dollars in grants over the years to develop Stan. And the fact that I also am with another QMSS former student, LLC member that uses Stan for business purposes requires under Columbia policy for me to tell you that, in situations like this, required to disclose these facts in presentations such as this one and literally every other class for the rest of the semester because it goes out on YouTube. So you should be aware of that for what it's worth, which in my opinion is not that much. So had some videos and a reading from today. The videos or the video for specifically today was put together by a guy named Ben Lambert, who's one of the many Stan users that we have now, and took it upon himself to write a book and make some videos that go along with the book. But the videos are mostly self-contained. So if you want to buy the book, it's not particularly expensive, but you're certainly not required to. But you can get a lot, or at least a sense of things from the videos, which are sort of pitched at maybe even an undergraduate level, and not getting into too much math or too much sophistication, but just try to put the ideas out there and give you some intuition for using them. And so those videos are usually pretty short, like 5 minutes. So I threw a bunch of them on the syllabus as the weeks go on, something that you can click on, kind of get an introduction to the topic before you dive into the reading. So the chapter for today comes from a book called Statistical Rethinking. It was actually the first book to feature Stan in the subtitle. It's by this guy, Richard McElraith, who is currently in Germany. And he also has YouTube videos for a class that he is teaching using Stan and his book. Really like the book. It's not available online through the Columbia Library System. So that's one reason why we don't utilize it as much. There is like one copy, physical copy in the library system somewhere. But it may very well be checked out at any particular point in time. Also, the first edition, which just came out like in 2016 or something like that, is already being revised, and the second edition is not available yet. I sent out an email where you can go to get a draft of that book in PDF form, and it had the password that you need to use. I'll put another thing on Campus Wire. For those of you who didn't see that email. Anyway, you can see that book as it develops into the second edition. So I really like the book. Not as enthralled with the R package he uses to access Stan. We're going to eventually build up by the end of April to be using the Stan language directly. But before then, we're going to be using some different R packages that allow you to estimate Stan models. But the ideas and the principles in that book and in that series of lectures are really consistent with, I think, what we're going to be talking about in this class and what Ben Lambert talks about in the videos that accompany his book in a class. So a few quotes that I think are particularly important from this first chapter of the first edition of that book. One of which is statistics is neither mathematics nor a science. It's a branch of engineering. And so it's really about how to, put stuff into practice But you need to also know the mathematics or the science, but then accompany that with the statistics, particularly the engineering part where you write code to accomplish what you're trying to do. And so one of the issues is that, advanced courses in statistics, such maybe some of the QMSS classes, certainly some of the stat classes, eventually do emphasize engineering, but a lot of people who are doing science or social science or biology, where Richard does his substantive research, have colleagues that just never get that far. They take one or two introductory classes that are required for their graduate program, and then they just go off and start doing research without ever getting to the courses that emphasize this engineering aspect of utilizing statistics and quantitative methods. And he says that teaching statistics in this way is a bit like, starting with bridge building and then ending with basic physics. It doesn't sound like a very good way to teach engineers how to build bridges. And people get themselves into trouble when they're out doing research and trying to do something, innovative in their research, pushing the boundaries, getting new knowledge, really the essence of what science is about, without having this sort of training in basic engineering as to how to do things. So it'd be like getting hydraulic engineers by just promoting your local plumber to be a hydraulic engineer. And the reason why, when you're doing innovative research, trying to do innovative research at least, you get yourself into trouble, is that the things that are taught in introductory classes that most people just take one or two of and then stop, are not very flexible, and they're also fragile. And so by inflexible, he means there's very limited ways in which you can adapt them to the unique research context or question that you're trying to answer in a given situation. Conversely, they're fragile because they often tend to fail in ways that are not obvious or not easy to see, or maybe impossible to detect given your data, when applied to contexts that are not what they were developed for. And so really what we need to have is more basic engineering. And the analog for basic physics, I think, for us who are trying to use quantitative methods, whether in the social sciences or any other field. I should have probably said at the beginning, yes, this is a QMSS class. We'll tend to use social science examples, but we're not going to get it too deep into any particular social science. Nothing that would go beyond what you might read in the newspaper or something like that. We have a lot of people on the waiting list from a lot of different fields at Columbia, and that's a good thing. But I wouldn't want anyone to feel like, well, maybe this class has like too much social science if you're from, biology. I think we have some people or something like that. It's, the social science aspect of it is very not deep. By that, I mean shallow. The quantitative methods, those are going to be intense. This is the most difficult class that the QMSS offers, and really trying to push the students who have a lot of capability to make themselves even better engineers. And so the sort of analog of basic physics for us is probability. By that, I mean a language that we can communicate with to describe our beliefs about uncertain, whether that's in the future, whether that's in the distant past, whether that's like so small that we can't, see it without a microscope, things like that. Things that we're uncertain about, we need a language to communicate our uncertain beliefs about various propositions that may come up in research. And unfortunately, QMSS doesn't really offer or do much to encourage people to take a even more basic course in probability, such as 4203, which is offered in the stat department. I think we have a couple people from the data science program they actually have a requirement to take like a half semester class along those lines, but that's not a requirement with QMSS. And so, like I said before, really the only actual prerequisite for a class like that is having some familiarity with R. But just because you like sort of satisfy that prerequisite doesn't mean you're actually prepared. Because in order to be sort of truly prepared, you would have needed to take not just like, you know, a probability class like this, but maybe a computer science class, you know, philosophy of science class, a bunch of different things that sort of can't be condensed into like a single class. And consequently, you know, in a 1-year program or 3-semester program like QMSS, we can't really have you know, a situation where you're like required to have taken 3 or 4 different classes in order to be, you know, let into a QMSS class, because there's simply not opportunity to do that if you didn't do it, you know, when you were undergraduate, and maybe your undergraduate program didn't even offer the classes that you would need to take in order to be really prepared for a class like this. Now, that doesn't mean you should drop this class. What it means is you have to be tolerant of the fact that you may encounter things that you weren't familiar with before, and you may have to take more time to brush up on those things or go more in depth on those. I would guess that like on average, this would be about a 12-hour a week class. Less in the weeks that we don't have homework, certainly more in the weeks that we do. We'll have homework about every second week. And that comprises like 50% of your grade for the semester, and the remaining third or whatever it would be comes from the final exam, which will be during final exam week. We don't have an exact date for that, but it'll be like the second week of May, somewhere around there. Anyway, got to be comfortable not being having taken classes that, you know, fully prepare you for something like this. And so to do Bayesian analysis, you need, you know, a lot of things, but principally this language of communication using probability. And so we'll start with that starting on Thursday and just dive right in. A couple of weeks later, we'll go from, you know, probability in the case of a discrete unknown to probability for continuous random variables. And then sometime, I think a little bit after spring break, we'll do probability theory for vectors and matrices and stuff like that. So we'll learn these things, but we learn it rather quickly. And the stuff that we learn could easily be like an entire semester of a probability class in like the stat department. Now, if you took a class in the stat department, you would be exposed to some things that you don't need for Bayesian analysis. So we sort of, you know, skip those. But, you know, really, you know, this, just the stuff on probability, which might take up like a third or something of our time this semester, could be a whole semester class by itself. But we need that just for the other 2/3 of the stuff that we're going to be doing this semester in terms of applying probability theory to social science research problems by using Bayesian analysis. And so, but like I said, that's, you know, not the only thing that you need to really to learn in order to just do Bayesian analysis. So you need not just some exposure to probability theory, but a good bit about computer programming. So we'll be learning that as we go along. It's going to come as a surprise to you. People maybe have even been doing quantitative methods for a considerable amount of time, how bad computers are at math. Like, they're awful. At least with the amount of accuracy that we're going to need to do you know, Bayesian analysis. And so we're going to have to learn stuff about numerical stability and cancellation and all kinds of things like that. And then on top of that, in order to apply Bayesian analysis to a problem that you're facing, you're going to need to know a good bit about the substance of what it is that you are trying to model in order to put together a good model for that substantive application. And so these are already like big things that you could take easily a whole class just on, if not more. And we're going to try to condense like all 3 or 4 of those things into a 1 semester thing, which means that, you know, we sort of, one, everything that we talk about has to tie into something else. We really don't have time, particularly during the Tuesday, Thursday sessions, to go off on, you know, too many tangents or anything like that. We have to be very efficient in getting through the material. But in addition to that, you know, it can be a fast pace, certainly, and it's sort of predicated on the you know, assumption or hope that you can understand these things with like 2 repetitions of it. So we'll talk about it in class. We'll do a homework. You get to see the answer key. It's not necessary that you have to understand everything immediately, but if it's taking you like 6 passes or something in order to grasp things, then you're just going to fall behind. And so we go through things quickly, and there's some repetition. There's certainly a lot of building on stuff that we did in previous weeks. So you can't really be like, well, I kind of understand it, because the next week you're really going to have to use it in a sophisticated way that you're not going to be able to do if you only kind of understand something. And so you need to be able to achieve a pretty good level of understanding of things that you may not have been exposed to before in 2 or 3 takes. And if you can get that, then it's certainly possible that we can get through all this stuff in a semester. We've been doing this, for 5 years now, or something, but it's always a bit frenetic, and it's not necessarily for everybody. Finally, in order to be Bayesian, to use Bayesian methods to publish papers or whatever that you're doing with quantitative methods, you have to be prepared for everyone else, including other Bayesians, maybe especially other Bayesians, to disagree with you. And so you have to be able to communicate your findings. You have to be able to stand up and argue for yourself, because that's pretty much going to be the only person arguing for you. And there's going to be a lot of people arguing against. And so it is contentious. It's controversial. And that's one of the things that we want to emphasize, class participation. And so get in the habit and the practice of, okay, what do I need to, make sure I have covered and understand it in order to present a Bayesian analysis and understand all the areas in which, other people are going to be disagreeing and criticizing that analysis, if not your entire approach. And so we'll be talking about some of these controversies and decent depth as we go along, but really, particularly for QMSS students, but oftentimes for people outside the QMSS, the using probability in a somewhat formal way is sort of the biggest step up compared to other classes in quantitative methods that you may have taken at Columbia or elsewhere. Questions about that? So we'll sort of be learning probability in maybe a little bit more of a theoretical way, but also applying it in a Bayesian way as we go along this semester. So we talk about probability. You can sort of see it, and a number of people have framed it this way, as an extension of classical propositional logic, sometimes called Aristotelian logic, sometimes called Boolean logic. Anyway, I'm not sure that Aristotle was literally the first person to figure this out, but he's certainly famous for a lot of things in science and math and stuff like that. He taught Alexander the Great how to be great. So somebody that you should probably take seriously famously said something like this, albeit in Greek, starting with the proposition that all men are mortal. That's the sort of major premise, and then minor premise. Socrates is or was a man. Ergo, if you combine proposition 1 and 2, you come to the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. Now, probably everyone in Greece already knew that from the fact that Socrates had been dead for like 100 years by the time Aristotle wrote this down. But this system of using deductive logic really, caught on in a variety of areas. However, there's pretty much zero applications of using this sort of deductive logic that are at all interesting in the social science. And the closest one that I can come up with that I know of is something called democratic peace theory. Probably the dumbest area of political science, but it goes a little something like this. Major premise, no two democracies fight a war against each other. Minor premise, Australia and Germany, just to take two countries, currently democracies. Ergo, Australia and Germany will not fight a war against each other. And this sort of pursuit has led to a literature where there have been like multiple papers over multiple years that are basically like, where they dispute the validity of this deductive conclusion by pointing to a case, and then they get into an argument as to was that country really a democracy, or was this conflict that happened really a war, or was it just kind of like a skirmish, or something like that. And it goes nowhere because it's not a really good question or a really good approach to something in social science to try to posit that there's some rule that Australia and Germany are not going to fight a war against each other. As to what are the reasons why there's a sort of probabilistic relationship, maybe a very high probabilistic relationship, why Australia and Germany are not going to fight a war against each other. And so a much better question would be, why are democracies such as these less likely to fight a war against each other compared to 99.9% of cases that there have been a war has involved at least one autocracy. Why is that? That's a perfectly good social science question, but it's a probabilistic one as opposed to trying to posit some like law of nature as to why it's impossible for two democracies to fight a war against each other. That seems pretty ridiculous. But conversely, if you think of it as a probabilistic relationship, then you could do something more from there. So how can we take this thing that Aristotle sort of established the validity of and generalize it to situations in which stuff is not absolutely true or absolutely false, but we might believe it to be true for to some degree or another. And so various people have sort of weakened Aristotelian logic to propositions that are just like maybe true or maybe false, not absolutely true or false. And you can think about this in R, those of you or other programming languages. If you use the keyword true, that maps to 1, and false maps to 0. And you can do arithmetic on these logical true and false things in the R language. And if you think about it that way, okay, so a probability or a proposition can be true or false. What is probability and how does it relate to it? Well, probability are all the real numbers between 0 and 1. They can express someone's degree of belief that some proposition is true or false, and you just have ones and zero being sort of the limiting case where you're completely sure that something is true or false. But in science, particularly social science, we're never really completely sure of anything. And so we're going to be using the real numbers between 0 and 1 to characterize our uncertain beliefs as to things are true at a particular point in time. So I used this example last year, and it kind of made sense. So I left it in, even though it's now a little bit outdated. But one of the things that we might be uncertain about is the future, even if now it's the past. So one way of using this, there's sort of not a major premise, but a very strong empirical regularity in the United States that parties of unpopular presidents tend to lose seats in midterm elections for Congress. At that time, and since 2016, Trump has been unpopular president, as measured in a lot of ways, has like about a 40-something% approval rating, but he has a very high disapproval rating and a very high percentage of people who strongly disagree with his policies and stuff like that. So if you combine those two things together, you come to the conclusion that the Republicans probably would lose seats in the 2018 election. And that turned out to be the case in the House, although not in the Senate, where they actually gained a couple seats. But anyway, neither of 1, 2, or 3 is guaranteed. It's not a law of nature. It's not like Socrates' mortal level of certainty about those things. But if you accept 1 and 2 as being like kind of plausible, then 3 seems plausible as well, to some degree, to the extent that you believe 1 or 2. And that's a more social, scientific, probabilistic way of doing induction about the things that we're studying. And so when you really get down to it, Bayesianism is a school of thought, a way of applying quantitative methods that uses probability to describe someone's degree of belief that some proposition is true, like the Republicans will probably lose seats in the 2018 midterm elections, and quantify our uncertainty about that statement. And that's a different way of using probability than a lot of other people have defined it. And we'll talk about that more as we go along today, and also for really the rest of the semester. But does everybody understand how this example I gave that sort of sounds likely true in sort of probabilistic terms can be seen as sort of an extension of this more absolute way of setting up the major premise and the minor premise used in propositional logic? And that what we're talking about here with like a social science application, we need to utilize some concept that bridges from false, probability 0 to true probability 1, where we can say, okay, this has like a probability 0.8 of being true and a probability 0.2 of being false. And if we can estimate those probabilities, how can we move on from there in a sort of scientifically responsible way, where when we make a statement, always attaching a probability that it's true to it in order to express our uncertainty about that. Because for a lot of things in social science, we don't want to say it's absolutely true that the elasticity of demand is like negative 0.3 for this product. That could change. It might not be exactly 0.3 or whatever. So we always want to be quantifying our uncertainty, saying, okay, there's a probability of 0.5 that it's the thing that we're estimating is between negative 0.25 and negative 4 or something like that. Attaching probability in order to quantify our uncertainty about the things that we're trying to do social science research on. Questions? Okay. So if probability is a way of expressing our uncertainty about the world in light of data, what are the sources of uncertainty? And I think there's 4 of them that we really want to be coming back to repeatedly over the course of this semester. One is uncertainty about the values of unknown parameters in models that we specify for various social scientific or other phenomenon. So like the elasticity of demand thing that I was talking about before, we don't know it's exactly negative 0.3. So we have uncertainty about that coefficient. Second source of uncertainty, we have uncertainty about what is the most appropriate, or what are the set of appropriate models that might be applicable to social science or otherwise science research situation. What model is best, or what models are good enough that we should even be considering, what are the values of the parameters in those models. And so we have uncertainty about both of those things. Third source of uncertainty about what to do with the output, how to utilize it, from the best models and, with the parameter estimates and so forth. If you have all that, then what do you do with it? How do you make a decision? What action do you take as a result of doing that application of quantitative methods to social sciences? And this, I think, is an underappreciated element, because there's all sorts of people who sort of input the the results of some analysis and then just kind of like wing it as to what to do with it, when really there is or can be a very systematic way of making decisions, taking actions in light of a quantitative analysis. But in order to do it in a very rigorous, systematic, well-justified way, you need to take into account your uncertainty of things. And so uncertainty about what to do with the output is certainly a very important consideration. And the fourth is uncertainty as to whether the software you're using works as intended. And that's not something you can really take for granted when trying to do innovative research, particularly if you're using these not very flexible, overly fragile things that are taught in the first couple introductory classes that most people doing quantitative research take and then stop. Not so much with the QMSS, but in a lot of other fields, social science fields or otherwise. And so the Bayesian approach, it uses probability to describe our uncertainty for the first 2 things: uncertainty about what parameters are, and uncertainty about what model or set of models is best. The Bayesian approach ties in very directly with what's known as decision theory, which prescribes, how to take an action, what decision to make in light of your uncertainty. And so that is basically the Bayesian answer to the third thing. The fourth source of uncertainty is not integrated with the other 3, but the Stan software does as much as we can to mitigate your uncertainty as to whether it's going to work. That's something that you can tell from the output whether it's not working, and you can do various things to validate that it should work in a particular case. And those sorts of features really not available with, not only the non-Bayesian approaches, but even Bayesian approaches from not that long ago, certainly in the 1990s, and other things that were being used didn't really allow you to have any sort of assessment as to whether the software is working correctly. Now, there's another class on Bayesian statistics that's being taught this semester in the stat department. I think it's actually from like 6 to 7:30 or something on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So you could check it out if you want to after this. Historically speaking, that class in the stat department hasn't emphasized Stan. It's emphasized this other forms of doing software for Bayesian analysis that were developed in the 1990s and became popular in certain areas of research, but in my opinion, shouldn't really be taught anymore, since 2011 that we have STAN, because of its ability to sort of tell you whether it's working as intended, that these older Bayesian ways don't. So there's other kinds of approaches that may sort of refer to probability or uncertainty or something like that, but don't really have an integrated approach to the four sources of uncertainty. They sort of miss at least one of them or handle them in sort of a weird way. But the other approaches to using probability and quantitative methods and things like that include randomization inference, frequentist inference, supervised learning, and we'll spend a slide or two on each of those next. But before we do that, I wanted to make sure everybody understands what these four sources of uncertainty that I'm talking about are, because we're going to be coming back to them over and over again as we go along this semester. Questions? Yes.
For two, is it like which model captures like the underlying phenomenon, or like minimizes error or some parameter?
Yes. So you might have, let's say, two or more candidate models, and you have some estimate maybe of, what works better, for a particular thing, but that's not going to be something that you know for certain. And so you want to allow for the possibility that what sort of looks like the best may not be the best. And, I guess right before spring break, we'll learn about techniques for combining the predictions from two or more different models in order to, achieve some goal. And so that is not something that's easy to do in, non-Bayesian frameworks unless you're really quantifying your uncertainty about every little piece in a rigorous way. Yes?
Following up on that question, if you're comparing two models and one is empirically better, but one is theoretically, in your opinion, better for whatever reason, is there a direction you go here, or do you just can you report both of them?
Right. So that's a good question. Really one of the advantages, and it kind of ties into 3 as well. So in order to make a sort of decision as to what you want to do with the results and stuff, you need to sort of specify a utility function as to what matters to you. So how much, emphasis do you want to put on having a coherent theoretical explanation? How much do you want to put on, estimating these parameters? How much you care about predictions that are functions of parameters, but not about the parameters themselves? So you can personally specify this utility function as to what matters to you, and then make the decision, take the action, reach the conclusion, etc., that maximizes that expected utility. And that, I think, is, gets into 3, but it's really one of the advantages of the Bayesian approach, and that you can use the results of it based on a substantive function, what matters to you, as opposed to something that doesn't really matter to anyone directly, like sum of squared errors. That's just sort of purely a statistical thing without any sort of substantive content behind it that takes into account, what was the purpose of doing the research? What were your goals? If you can reflect that in a utility function, then you can make a solid decision about that. You got a follow-up?
Yeah. Is this idea of a utility function in research, or is this kind of just a metaphor you developed here?
It's something that the researcher, or whoever the researcher is working for, needs to come up with, and it comes into play after you've done the analysis. So it's related to the rest of the things. You have to have uncertainty, being propagated into it and things like that. But it's sort of a separate piece to it. You had a question? No? Other questions? Okay, so other forms of inference. One is randomization inference. So in the 1920s, this guy, R.A. Fisher, who was an evolutionary biologist, devised a method for doing inference in experiments. So randomized experiments. Really, the parameter of interest in an experiment is usually the average treatment effect or something like that. just for the subjects or plants or whatever it is that participate in the experiment. There's not really a model to speak of in the same way that we would talk about in economics or something like that. So experiments are known for having internal validity, but are easier to criticize their external validity or their generalizability. So it's harder to say what to do with your estimate of your average treatment effect, once you have it. So given that this drug is like, somewhat effective for reducing the symptoms of something, in order to make a decision as to whether to approve that drug for like mass production and stuff like that, you have to take into account the costs and the side effects and all these other things that sort of go beyond just the average treatment effect of the efficacy of that drug. But anyway, the implementation of that in the software is relatively simple and it's hard to mess up. And indeed, in the 1920s, even when they didn't have any software, Fisher knew how to get this right. So imagine we're doing an experiment on you all, or at least the 22 people of you all who are officially registered for the class. There's like 700,000 different ways I can take the 22 people that are officially registered and put 11 of them in a treatment group and the other 11 in a control group. But I choose that one way at random. It can either be flipping coins, or these days people just use their computers to say which 11 people randomly get put in treatment and which 11 randomly get put in control. And the thing about randomization inference and Fisher's perspective on it is that the randomization, explicit randomization of the treatment variable by the researcher creates the need for probability. So if I randomize who gets put in the treatment group and who gets put in the control group, everything that happens downwind of that randomization is a random variable, including the outcome that I'm measuring and the difference between the average outcome between the treated people and the control people, and all the things that happen subsequent to that instant of randomization is a random variable. And we need probability in order to understand those random variables that are created by the decision to randomize this treatment. And when we make those probability distributions for everything that happens after treatment, those probability distributions are conditional on everything before treatment. And so this decision to randomize sort of creates this split in time where everything before is taken as given, everything that happens afterwards is a random variable, and we need probability in order to understand the distribution of those random variables conditional on everything past, and the assignment to treatment or control. And so that is a very important development historically, and had a huge influence on the way experiments were conducted. They didn't have social science at the time in the 1920s. That was something that arguably came into prominence in the 1940s or so. And so they couldn't have, Fisher and other people who promoted this view couldn't really have had social science the way we think about it in mind when thinking about these things that we do a lot of research these days that isn't an experiment, but you can understand how probability would come into play in an experiment because of the decision to randomize who gets put into treatment, who gets put into control. So what do we do with randomization inference? Okay, we randomize, then the treatment people get the drug and the control people get the placebo, and then we measure the outcome, and then we estimate the average treatment effect as the average difference in outcomes between the control people and the treated people. But then what we do is that we ask the question, well, what about the other 700,000 and change ways in which I could have divided 22 people into two groups of 11, one of which actually happened and 700,000 of which didn't happen. But for all of those 700,000, 5,431 ways that we could do it, I could calculate the difference in the outcome between this group and that group. And I can do that 700,000 times for all the different ways that I could put 11 out of 22 people in a treatment group. And those 700,000 differences of means between this 11 people and that 11 people form a distribution of possible estimates. And what Fisher said, well, if the treatment has literally no effect, then the one estimate that you get from the one realization into treatment and control that actually happened shouldn't be systematically different from all those other 700,000 ways of doing a difference in means between this 11 people and that 11 people if the treatment has, no effect at all. But conversely, if the treatment effect does something for better or for worse, then we would anticipate the estimate in the breaking into treatment and control that actually happened to be more extreme than possibly any other way of putting 11 people into 11 people into group A and 11 people into group B and doing a difference in means, because all those other 700,000 ways are going to have, some people who actually got the drug and some people who were actually got the placebo in the same group, and being compared to group B that also has some people who got the drug and some people who got the placebo. So if the drug is actually effective, then we should anticipate the one estimate that actually happens to be more extreme than the estimates for all the ways of breaking people into two groups, A and B, of 11 people that could have happened but randomly didn't. And so this idea of a p-value, as originally conceived, was, well, what proportion of this 700,000 estimates that we could get from breaking people into group A and group B, each of 11, are more extreme than the one estimate of the average treatment effect that we actually got from the actual realization into treatment and control. If that number is small, then it's sort of evidence against a null hypothesis of no effect. But in Fisher's way of formulating, there wasn't really an alternative hypothesis. There was just a null hypothesis, and you could marshal evidence against it. And this is one way of phrasing that in units of probability. Well, what's the proportion of these 700,000 ways in which I could obtain an estimate that's more extreme than the one estimate I did get from the actual realization of people into treatment and control? And that's where the p-value originally came from, even though it's used in a bit of a different way today. At or around a little bit later, at the same time, Fisher also came up with methods of inference for observational data, particularly the method of maximum likelihood, where the goal is to make inference about a population or a population parameter from a relatively small but random sample of units of observation from that population. And this differs from randomization inference, where you're only really interested in estimating the average treatment effect among the people in the experiment. So there's not so much of a distinction between sample and population. But if you're doing, survey research or something like that, then there's no explicit treatment, but there is still randomization, and the randomization comes into play as to whether you are one of the few people from the overall population that is selected to be in the sample, and then we estimate some stuff from the sample in order to make inferences about the population. And so the British population around Fisher's time was about 36 million. And let's say the government wanted to take a sample, which that time would have been huge, of like 500 people. Well, there's e to the power of like 6,000 different ways that you could take a random sample of 500 people out of 36 million, one of which is actually going to happen. And like e to the 6,000 or more could have happened, but don't. And so the data collector chooses one of those sampling realizations at random, gives the data to the analysis, and the analyst wants to estimate something about the population on the basis of this sample. So you might sort of go in the same direction. What about all the ways that we could have drawn a sample of 500 that could have happened but randomly didn't? Well, we can't really estimate, the parameter for a sample that didn't occur. And the reason why we're doing sampling in the first place is it's way too expensive to survey the entire population, maybe even impossible. So we want a sample, and we want that sample to be random, so it's representative of the population. So the estimates that we get from a sample are representative of a population. So in contrast to randomization inference, where we actually can compute all 700,000 or whatever it may be, differences in means to break 22 people that we actually have data on into two groups of 11. Here we don't have data on all 36 million. We just have data on one sample of size 500 from that population. But we can sort of work out analytically what is the distribution of the sample mean estimator of a parameter across ways in which 500 people could have been drawn from a sample of 36 million. And that turns out to be a normal distribution. And we can use that probability distribution to characterize our uncertainty about an estimator across samples that could have occurred but didn't. And, the less uncertainty, the better. What we use today is sort of a mix of Fisher and a different group led by Neyman and Pearson the Younger, who in the 1930s sort of developed a kind of different way of doing frequentist inference that emphasized this idea of hypothesis testing. But that is different from what you see today. And you had 2-point hypotheses, like one hypothesis, the first one is like this parameter is 0. The other hypothesis is this parameter is 1, or some other number that's not 0. And of those two things, you're supposed to choose which is the better estimate for this parameter population. It's different and frankly more internally consistent than what you see today in social science, where you have like a null hypothesis that this parameter is 0, and the alternative hypothesis is it's like anything that's not 0. So you're comparing a point hypothesis against an interval alternative hypothesis. Back originally, you had 2 points, and you did the hypothesis test between those two. So we'll have opportunity to talk about that as we go along this semester, but it brings back in a couple more quotes from McElreath that I thought were important. And he says the greatest obstacle that he encounters, and he's actually in evolutionary biology, but it's the same with social science, I think, that he encounters among students and colleagues, is the tacit belief that the proper objective for statistical inference is to test a null hypothesis. And there's several reasons why he thinks that's not the right mindset that people should be taking. One is that hypotheses are not models. You can have the same hypothesis substantively being implied by 2 or more different models that are mutually exclusive of the phenomenon of interest. Conversely, any model that you specify is going to have elements of it that go beyond the narrow hypothesis that you're trying to say something about. And so let's say in political science, you might have a hypothesis that the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote, and that sort of seems empirically regularity in every place except India. But it's not like the model that you're estimating just pertains to income and voting. There's education, and there's race, and there's all kinds of other things that are correlated with stuff that also contribute to the probability that someone votes or doesn't vote in an election. And so we're almost never in the social science in a situation in which we can specify a theoretical model so narrowly that it matches up 1-to-1 with a hypothesis, null or otherwise. And so multiple hypotheses being implied by the same model, multiple models implying the same hypothesis, means you can't really get anywhere with this kind of Aristotelian deductive testing approach to social science. And even if you could specify a model in such a narrowly tailored way in which you say, I'm actually testing this hypothesis and no other one, measurement error in the data, which is particularly prevalent in social science, prevents any sort of a strict falsification approach. Even if sort of the computer says this is false, the data that you fed it were also false. They weren't the true measurements of the concepts that you're trying to utilize in your model. And so you don't know whether the conclusion, don't know for sure whether the conclusion that you reached was because the data was flawed or because the hypothesis was flawed. And so we're never going to be able to achieve this sort of strict falsification approach in something like the social science. But what researchers really need, according to McElraith, is a set of principles for designing, building, refining special purpose statistical procedures that, they have this, everywhere, but it's often not, taught in introductory classes. And his approach, rethinking statistics, has benefits in that it's a set of strategies as opposed to like cookie cutter tools for this is what you do in a particular situation in order to test and hopefully falsify a hypothesis, moving away from that mindset into one that has three main features that, according to him, but I would also agree with. One, Bayesian data analysis, so we can take into account and be responsible with our uncertainty for the 3 or the 4 sources of uncertainty that I was talking about. Multi-level models that allow heterogeneity across the data generating process, and comparison of different models that are mutually exclusive, that pertain to the same phenomenon, and being able to combine those into a coherent approach is, really what we're doing today. Don't call me. Shut up. Anyway, okay, a couple more minutes. So with Bayesian inference, uncertainty about what's true and what's not true creates the need for probability to describe our beliefs, as opposed to explicit randomization of someone into treatment or control, or randomization of picking somebody from the population to be in the sample. So you might think about how your beliefs are as to how much the S&P 500 is going to grow this year. And those beliefs you might, normal with like 2% real growth and a standard deviation of 5%. That might be one representation of your belief. But as more data comes in over the course of 2019, you'll have tons of opportunities to update your beliefs as to what the S&P will end up, at the end of this year or whatever point in time. And you can describe your beliefs as they evolve using probability distributions. And in the case of the S&P 500, there's no sample. There's no randomization. There's no treatment. There's no control. There's none of that sort of necessitated probability from Fisher's perspective. But the uncertainty about what something is going to be in the future is an alternative justification for using probability to describe those beliefs in a rigorous way as they change, as more and more data comes in that you can condition on. So you don't have the same motivation for using probability that Fisher did. Finally, supervised learning. That's something that we talked about in my class in the fall. So suppose you have a data set of size n, usually not an experiment, usually not a sample. So the Fisher thing doesn't really apply. There's like a bunch of ways. There's a formula involving factorials that you could divide this data set into a training set and a testing set of size n minus n. So the analyst is going to choose one split at random and then, apply some optimization procedure to minimize the loss function, and then predict the outcome in the testing data on the basis of the estimates so obtained. So what about all the other ways that you could have split your original data set into training and testing? In principle, that implies a distribution of predictive accuracy, for other ways that you could have split into training and testing and then predicted the outcome in the testing measure. So you could think about a probability distribution over your predictive measures that is generated much in the randomization inference by your decision to randomly split some observations into training and some into testing. But in practice, a lot of people in data mining don't really worry so much about that source of uncertainty, in part because they're dealing with so large data sets that it could be kind of negligible. But data mining people, or that sort of approach, often ignores the other types of uncertainty as well. And those are stuffs that we want to continue to keep account of. So I made a table here of sort of the different approaches to using quantitative methods, what it is they consider to be fixed and thus condition on, what is random, and then anytime you have something that's random, you have an opportunity to average over the randomization part in order to make some sort of a conclusion or take an action as the result of it. And so these have different assumptions about the different things, but the key point about the Bayesian approach that we're going to be talking about this semester, what's random? It's your beliefs about the unknown, whether that's parameters, theta, or something else. And then you have functions of the unknown that you want to average over in order to take an expectation. And the reason for doing that is because you want to take a decision or make an action that sort of maximizes your expected utility over the distribution of things that you don't know. And that's really the essence of the Bayesian approach and how it contrasts with some of these other approaches that you've probably been exposed to more. So that's all we have time for today. I hope you'll stay with the class, register or put yourself on the waiting list as appropriate. And we will pick it up on Thursday. And we're going to be diving right into probability, albeit in the somewhat simpler case where the things that we don't know are discrete and can be defined with like a finite number of elements. Anyway, see you Thursday.